Now, the first round of France's presidential election is just over a month away, but the campaign has been completely overshadowed by the situation in Ukraine. After making a muted announcement of his re-election bid, Emmanuel Macron will have his first campaign outing this Monday. He'll be meeting with locals in Poissy, west of Paris, where the mayor is one of his close supporters. Well, for some analysis on the latest in France's campaign, we can speak to Andrew Smith, a senior lecturer in contemporary history and politics at the University of Chichester. He'll actually be joining us every Monday leading up to the election. Professor Smith, it's wonderful to have you here. Now, Macron's hardly done any campaigning at all due to the crisis in Ukraine, but could you actually say that the war is sort of doing the job for him?
I think that's almost a fair thing to say. He is, at the minute, I think, demonstrating leadership, and that is his greatest asset, I think, in terms of his presidential re-election bid. Now, it's important to not look at this through entirely cynical eyes. He, of course, has a very important job to do as president, leading the response to the conflict. And of course, we've seen that he's been strongly involved in diplomatic efforts, ongoing right up to the last minute before conflict as well. But this has provided something of, something of a platform for him to raise himself above the other candidates. At the moment, as we've seen in polling data so far, I think, a poll on Saturday for Le Monde put Macron right up to about 30% of voting intentions in the first round, whereas his closest competitors were down still around, 14% for Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour. So this is, I think, a really important thing that allows him to distinguish himself. Now, as you said, it's going to limit his ability to campaign. We saw, of course, that first big rally which had been planned in Marseille was cancelled. Instead, as you mentioned, he's going to be doing something much closer to home in Ile-de-France. He'll be, visiting a much smaller event and really taking his first steps as a candidate. And we already got a sense as well about what the likely kind of schedule that Macron will follow will be. Of course, people in his camp have already spoken about this idea of application, explanation, and then project. I think the people of France can probably expect another letter from Monsieur Macron in mid-March as well to kind of outline further these ideas around his campaign. So it's going to be a strange campaign. It will be strange, but it's going to be one in which we have a series of challengers really fighting above themselves, shadowboxing a president who is really committed to remaining in the Elysee, but also doing that job in the Elysee until the last possible moment, I think.
And the conflict with Russia has also caused embarrassment for some candidates who had expressed sympathy with Vladimir Putin. What kind of rhetoric have we been hearing from some of the other candidates about what's happening in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Of course, as it's emerged, a lot of the other candidates, a lot of the key challengers, if we're honest, all have slightly unusual links with Vladimir Putin and the kind of Russian regime in general. We've seen, plenty of sort of unwelcome photos from the past wheeled out of candidates gleefully shaking hands with Putin and all the rest of it. Of course, that affected Marine Le Pen. Of course, we heard about, there was rumours that there were these election publications going to be scrapped, of which millions had been published, showing her shaking hands with Putin. Of course, we've seen clips put together. There's lots circulating online. There's, debate about whether some of it comes from the Pécresse campaign or not, of people like Eric Zemmour, of course, shaking hands, I guess kind of rhetorically shaking hands with Putin, expressing admiration for Putin, for his regime, and about the idea of Russia being a sort of, authoritarian democracy, which is perhaps something more to his liking. Of course, that's been exacerbated in very recent days as well with the rallying of Marion Maréchal Le Pen to Zemmour's campaign. She herself, again, we can see, in the past has frequently been quite admiring of Putin's regime, and of course has been involved in a lot of transfers, even when she was a deputy in the Vaucluse before her kind of walk through the wilderness, or whatever you might want to call it. The other candidate that has a kind of long history of this involvement is, of course, Mélenchon. Jean-Luc Mélenchon has a sort of contrarian worldview, you might think, in which he's often admired people who challenge kind of the mainstream consensus, and that's pushed him to endorse all kinds of people. He has, just at the weekend, he's kind of endorsed himself against, he calls the Putin war, and without really engaging in these ideas of his past. And of course, a big part of his campaign is still withdrawing from NATO as well, which is certainly a troubling prospect in times like this. So across Macron's competitors, there is a wide degree of people, and of course, that's not even to mention, people like François Fillon, of course, a luminary of the Républicain Party, who was working very closely with the Russian energy sector. So there's a wide array of engagement. I think we're seeing a lot of support channeled towards Macron, who is leading a campaign which says, look, the worst is to come. This is about engagement. This is about trying to prevent the worst of this conflict. But it's not necessarily about seeking conflict itself. I think Macron's been very clear that France is not at war with Russia. It is supporting Ukraine as a democratic country that is being invaded by another predatory nation. And I think that is an important distinction which many French people have rallied around. This seems of a different character to the presidential election, something much more important to focus on in terms of the rights and wrongs of international diplomacy and the rights and wrongs of that kind of moral engagement, I think. So yes, a very long shadow cast by this Russian invasion of Ukraine over the presidential elections so far.
And do you think that the shadow that has been cast because of the conflict, do you think that there's any risk that that could sort of delegitimize the results of this campain, of the election?
It is a challenge. Yeah, absolutely. It is a challenge because, of course, we saw just recently the Prime Minister Jean Castex drew all of the other candidates in, expressed a commitment that this would go ahead, expressed a commitment that France would have her democratic discussion and that we would see a fully fought campaign. And that seems to be a very important element of it. Of course, in his letter to the French people, Emmanuel Macron specifically said, look, I'm not going to be able to campaign as I might otherwise. I'll be president first, effectively, and candidate second. Now, as we said already, that's a helpful stance for Macron, who's able to demonstrate leadership, to demonstrate his key commitments to things like state security, to European adhesion, and a European strategic autonomy. A lot of those things are extraordinarily important. I think we're going to find it difficult to see Macron in front of those same types of debates we might expect. I think Macron will seem somewhat aloof from this presidential campaign. It's why he says he calls on activists involved in La République en Marche in the villages and towns, and those will be important steps. So, it's going to be a challenge. I think we are going to see a campaign which is marked, which is overshadowed by this conflict. But we strongly hope that there will be a good opportunity for democratic engagement, for debate, for a stronger outline of Macron's policies, because all we have right now is a sort of, a very kind of abstract impression of what Macron's priorities will be, as well as
Andrew
a lot of
Smith, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your analysis this morning.
Thank you so much.
Again, that was Andrew
Cheers.
Smith, a senior lecturer in contemporary history and politics at the University of Chichester, and he will be joining us every Monday leading up to the election, so do stay tuned for that.